Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, as the world is focused on the Israel Hamas war, Russia's illegal war in Ukraine rages on. And some countries are beginning to question support for Ukraine, and political leaders, such as Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, has privately expressed that people are becoming weary of the war. But our guest today says that there is a huge benefit in a Ukraine victory. Can Ukraine maintain the support needed to turn Russia back? That issue next. Joining me from Brussels is Robert Vass, the founder and president of Globsec, a Central and East European based think tank committed to enhancing security, prosperity, and sustainability in Europe. His annual Globsec Forum is among the top 5 conferences in the world, alongside the World Economic Forum, and has been attended by world leaders such as Pope Francis, President Zelensky, Ursula von der Leyen, Emmanuel Macron, Christine Lagarde, and David Cameron. In 2017, he received a special award of Governor of the National Bank of Romania in recognition of his efforts to create a safer transatlantic community. Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
Start off with this way. You obviously want a lot of support for Ukraine. And there's been a lot of skepticism voiced lately. Comments that came out, for example, from Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who's talking about nations becoming weary of supporting Ukraine. And in fact, your own country, Slovakia, your new Prime Minister, Robert Fico rather, is stopping munitions, still supporting, but the idea of military support has been changed. So, one, I'd like to ask you, how did he come to that conclusion, and how does this affect some of the other border states, such as Romania, Hungary, and Poland?
Definitely, and thank you for your question. What happened on the 24th of February in 2022 was a game changer for all Central Europe. We thought that a full-scale war in Europe would never be possible. And actually, we've seen signs in the past of more aggressivity from Russia towards its neighbors. We've seen it in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Crimea. But somehow Europe thought that a full-scale war of this kind would not be possible. But still, it happened, and Vladimir Putin has been following his words that he wants to restore, what was left from the Soviet Union, and that the collapse of Soviet Union was one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes of the 20th century. Also, he has been saying very clearly that he doesn't believe in the Ukrainian nation, and he doesn't believe in their right to decide where they want to belong. So he has been following very consistently with his action what he thought. So what happened was, as a consequence, not only an attack on a neighboring country, on a sovereign neighboring country that was absolutely unprovoked, but it was an attack on the very foundations of European order and European peace. And what we've seen as a consequence is what Vladimir Putin did not count on. It was a tremendous and unprecedented unity of Europe and the United States and the West in supporting Ukraine. Also, what he underestimated was the reaction of Ukrainians to defend their freedom. And because Ukrainians wanted to fight for their freedom and for their future and for their country, we've been able to align against Ukraine. Because, as I'm saying now, the future of our institutions that are guaranteeing our way of life is being decided in Eastern Europe. So actually, the future of the West is being decided in the East, in the Eastern Europe. Or I would put it even differently, the future of a rule-based world is being decided now, how we perform in this situation. And we've seen more than a year unprecedented support militarily, financially, in terms of humanitarian support. Ukrainians have been able to not only to get back large parts of the territories, but they've been able to show to the world that Russian army is not so strong, and it can be defeated. Now, of course, after more than a year, when we look at the more global landscape, the geopolitical situation has become much more difficult, because as a consequence, the prices of energy went up. Inflation in Europe went up. There is another front line of the same war, which is going on in the digital sphere, in the disinformation. The disinformations about the Russian war are spread across all of the Europe and the world, and we have to win all of these front lines in order to be able to help the Ukraine. So there is a fatigue, and also as a consequence of the economic pressure, there are also governments saying that to how long we can still support Ukraine. But I think that we cannot give up, and the only option is to support Ukraine, because by supporting Ukraine, we are defending the rules on which the European security and the global security basically is based upon. So we will be seeing a lot of political attempts to change this increasingly. There are several elections that next year that are very important, including the US presidential elections. But I think it's very important for us as Central Europeans, but also us as a free world, to argue that defending Ukraine is about preventing any future war. Because if we send a signal that we cannot defend Ukraine, actually a country on our borders, who will be impressed in the future when we talk anything about Taiwan, or whether we talk about defending any other country far away? And how can somebody trust us in the future when they will become under pressure if we will be unable to fully stand behind a country that was brutally attacked?
But I want to continue with that. You know, in the report that was issued from Globsec, talking about the benefits for a Ukrainian victory, as well as some of the negative aspects if there's inactivity in supporting Ukraine. You spend a lot of time, the report spends a lot of time talking about investment, foreign direct investment, and the like, and in terms of their GDP and how a Ukrainian victory can obviously add to the investment in a lot of the Eastern European nations. Um, but you also talk about, in order for that to happen, some of the nations are going to have to increase their support via military means. To, for example, you talk about how most countries are not providing, with the exception maybe of Lithuania, a huge portion of their GDP in terms of military. But when you look at people like the United States, a nation like the United States, who is spending a lot of money right now, and it's a point of contention right now, particularly amongst the Republican Party in the United States. How do you convince a nation like the United States, which is still the linchpin for whether or not Ukraine wins, how do you convince them that this is really in their economic benefit and not simply one of intellectual benefit in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, indeed, we have issued a report which is called Ukraine Costs of Inaction and Benefits of Action. and we've tried to calculate what are the costs of several scenarios as this war can unfold. And we look basically on three scenarios. The first was Russian victory, the second was a frozen conflict, and the third was a Ukrainian victory. Ukrainian victory means a peace negotiated on the Ukrainian demands. Now, we've tried to look just from the economic point of view and not to bring in geopolitics or ideology behind. So we really try to look at it from the money perspective. What we found is the basic outcome is that the costs of our support today to Ukraine are much smaller than the costs we would need to pay if there is a continued long-term frozen conflict or if Russia wins. And it has an impact in several areas. First, if Russia will be able to create a long-term frozen conflict in Ukraine, Central European countries would need to dramatically increase their defense spending. It is expected to defend the eastern flank of NATO. We would need to go into 4 to 5% of GDP. We would need to massively invest into our own defense because that would be a paradigm shift. From deterrence, we would need to shift our capabilities for potential war fighting because potentially Russians can be on our borders. Number two, there is an impact for how much are we paying for the depth of the country, because this is on the border of a major conflict. The costs of the state debt are much higher, and the investors are looking at that. And the third are the direct investments. And we are seeing that investors will be more hesitating to invest in the Eastern Europe. So basically, if we only will continue to support Ukraine in a way that it does not completely lose, but we will be unable to help them to win, it would mean in long term a lot of costs, but also little benefits. Because if we want the benefits coming from the reconstruction of Ukraine, there will need to be a clear security guarantees for Ukraine. And the highest security guarantee is the NATO membership. Without NATO membership, there will be much less companies and private capital who would like to invest in Ukraine. So if we really want to also gather the benefits of all of our support in long term, we need to make sure that Ukraine gets into NATO and EU, they got the security guarantees, and that we will be able to mobilize private capital for reconstruction. And with that, also our companies and economies can benefit from a stronger Ukraine. Look, this is a big country. It's a country of over 40 million people. It's a huge market. They have excellent labor skills. And this country has shown that it has not collapsed. The state services did not collapse under the pressure of war. Many other countries would collapse simply. And one of the reasons is because they went through massive digitalization. And actually, in the digital services of their country, they are much further than many of the countries of Europe.
Let me ask you this. In the report, you do say that one of the things that seems to be most likely at this stage is going to be a frozen conflict. So where would you be on the issue of if the conflict is indeed frozen, would you support Ukraine coming into NATO? And given the new governance of Slovakia, would Slovakia support Ukraine joining NATO under the context of being in a frozen conflict?
That is exactly what we need to prevent. When we are saying that frozen conflict looks now as the most probable, is because if we will continue our military and financial support on the same level and we don't step it up, it will be very difficult for Ukrainians to win. Because it's not only about the amount of support, but the speed of that support. The sooner we would get the military support, the faster they would be able to end this war and show some kind of results. But to state, for example, to say today is that we will stay in Ukraine as long as it takes, it's not a winning strategy. We need to say, we want Ukraine to win. And it does not necessarily need to, and we should not define it, what does it mean? Ukrainians should define what does it mean. They should define it. And they should decide when they want to stop the war. But if we just push the two sides to the negotiation table and we create the kind of Minsk agreement that was there from the past, we see that it did not work because a frozen conflict have a tendency to unfroze. So if there will be a situation for any kind of peace agreement or negotiation, this should be initiated from Ukraine. Second, we should support it. But third, we should make sure that the peace that could be negotiated will be just and sustainable. Because just to come to the same situation that we sit at the same table as nothing would happen and we draw a new line is not just and not sustainable. War crimes need to be punished because otherwise there will be no sense of fairness, and that needs to be done. But I look at this analysis that we made. And simply let me say that, for example, I will talk about Poland. Poland is probably, when you put together all the support for Ukraine, it was 4.3 billion US dollars. But if there would be a Russian victory, just for Poland, we have calculated that the costs would be annually 25 billion US dollars. And if we look at the 5 years term, it's X5. So the costs of a potential Russian victory are much bigger. In terms of frozen conflict, we are talking about 4.3 versus 12.7 million US dollars annually. That would be the costs of a potential frozen conflict. So if we would decide in the upcoming year or months that we want Ukraine to win, because also it helps, it's morally just, but also it's economically beneficial, then we would need to decide that we are stepping up our support next year, so that Ukrainians can show some kind of victory in Ukraine. And not only that, it is a message to any future aggressor across the world that, look, West will defend its principles and the borders.
Yeah, you do spend a lot of time, because you are talking about a cost-benefit analysis, and a lot of it is spent on how much Poland should give, and Hungary, and other countries within Eastern and Central Europe. But isn't a lot of that dependent upon how much the West, in particular the United States, is going to support what Ukraine does? Because even though your report is really talking about cost-benefit analysis and it tries to stay away from political nuances, the reality is the U.S. has an election coming up in 2024. And the general thinking that if President Biden loses, the financial support for Ukraine will more or less be ended or severely decreased. So, how do you begin to not only talk about Central and European countries increasing how they support and how much they support Ukraine with, but also talking to the United States and other Western nations that this is in your financial interest as well?
Exactly, this is the argument we have to do, because um, I refuse to take a situation that if there will be a change in the government in the US or somewhere else, um, the support will just end. I think it's uh, our mission as well to explain that it's not only morally just, but it's economically important. But also, I would even say that the future of American-led world, American or American democracy is being decided in Eastern Europe. So it might seem as a far, far away conflict, but actually it impacts the ability of the United States to project soft power across the world in the future. And if we are unable to sustain this test, then which countries across Europe or in the world will trust the institutions that are led by the United States, that it will be able to defend the interests in the future. So this is a message about every future conflict. And look, Vladimir Putin is clear. He is saying a few weeks ago, he said that I don't really, um, I'm not interested in the particular territory in Ukraine. It's less important to me. What we are trying to achieve, and he is very clear in that, is the change in the global order. So they, through Ukraine, they want to challenge the American leadership. If we stop supporting Ukraine, the American leadership will be challenged to the extent that would be irreversible. And this argument needs to be set across. And look, when you look at another conflict in the Middle East, what happens in Israel, paradoxically, Israel is the biggest. So what's happening there in the Middle East and in Gaza is the biggest threat to Ukraine as well, because it's decreasing the attention of the world from Ukraine to the other parts of the world. And just imagine that somebody else would take advantage of the situation when the United States or the West are preoccupied by two conflicts and creates potentially a third or fourth smaller conflicts across the world. This would be very, very, very dangerous. Look what Russia has been doing, also through Wagner Group in Africa. They've been able to partner with the dictatorships across Africa, and pushing out Western European countries. So this is very dangerous. So they are playing a more global game.
Now, that brings me to this point as well. Even though, let's say, Globsec, for example, which is a very prominent and influential think tank, even though you're central to Eastern and Central Europe, is this now an opportunity, let's say, for institutions such as yours to begin reaching out to create other partnerships with, for example, Global South nations, to begin also thinking about investment opportunities in terms of not only Eastern Europe, but partnerships, trading relationships? If this is an opportunity to go beyond just Central and Eastern Europe, to, like you just said, nations in Africa, um, Latin America, and the like, to begin having this kind of conversation as well.
This is exactly the thinking that we are having, because the struggle that we are in, and that's defending the rule-based world. I think it's a struggle that can be not won only locally. This needs to be a coordinated global global endeavor to stand behind the rules that have helped the world to grow with prosperity and with predictability and rules. Because it is in nobody's interest that one of the basic rules is that you don't change borders by force. I think behind this principle, even global South, even India, even other countries who are, let's say, sometimes more neutral, I think this principle is very powerful, and nobody is interested in a jungle where a stronger neighbor can change borders just because it decides so. So yes, I think it is a time to start to reach beyond just the traditional, I would say, traditional Western-like democracies, but to try to make global partnerships, saying that what is the alternative to the rule-based world? What is the alternative to the world which is led by principles that have been created together? The alternative is a jungle where stronger neighbors can just come and change the borders because they don't like the political environment in that country. I think we need to refuse this idea, and we need to refuse the idea of spheres of influence where Russia or other countries says that I have a veto right over my neighboring country, what it wants. I think we need to refuse that, because that's a clash of two worlds. It's a clash of the old imperial world, where you think that you have the right, the veto right over your neighboring countries, or the world of freedom. I say the world of the future, where every nation, whether small or big, can decide where it belongs and what kind of representation they would like to elect, what kind of policies they would like to have, if they are not threatening the stability in the region.
Let me ask you this. There's been some discussion in the U.S., talking about investment. But one of the issues that has come up is the idea of the rebuilding of Ukraine. And as you said, the service sector has pretty much remained intact. But in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure and all of that, there's been talk about taking Russian reserves, foreign reserves, which is which is being held by a number of Western nations. Um, do you agree with that? And could that also be an incentive for people saying, listen, there are billions of dollars in reserves that are ready to go right now to rebuild Ukraine if other nations are willing to partner? Are you in favor of taking those foreign reserves and using them to rebuild Ukraine?
I'm absolutely in favor of this effort, because I think Russia needs to pay the biggest bill for reconstruction, and this can be taken from the frozen reserves. Absolutely, it's a legal issue as well, and I don't know all the legal nitty-gritties of that, but I think the world has to find a way to have Russia pay for what it created in Ukraine and in the world. And I think these frozen assets are the best way to start. Also, just to say, it is so we cannot see a situation where Russia has created and destroyed the infrastructure in Ukraine, and then the reconstruction should be paid by European Union and the United States. If they have destroyed it, they need to be part of the reconstruction. And I think that this is the biggest leverage, one of the biggest leverages we have. I would very hardly want to imagine a situation where after the war, or let's say a peace agreement is done, then Russia takes all its assets and moves to Russia. I think I think there needs to be fairness and justice to this world.
You as head of Globsec have had conversations with President Zelensky and members of his administration. Is it time for President Zelensky to start talking in the very way that your report talks about? The notion of the benefits of a victory of Ukraine beyond the notion, again, as we stated, beyond the notion and of governance, of democracy versus authoritarianism, but also begin talking to nations about the benefits of investment in Ukraine should Ukraine win. Is that a stance that President Zelensky should be taking now?
Absolutely, that is a stance that he should be talking about as well. But we should be talking about in our democracies internally when we are arguing for keeping the unity for Ukraine as long as possible or until they win. I think this argument is very, very important. But this needs to be heard from our Ukrainian friends as well. So this voice needs to be strong. This needs to be coordinated, and it needs to be also, because we've done one specific cost-benefit analysis that is focused on Central European nations. I think it would be worth to do the same exercise for the whole European Union and the United States as well, especially ahead of your elections. Because if many of the candidates, if they would see the clear numbers behind, they would simply see that the costs today for supporting Ukraine is much smaller than the costs United States would need to pay if Ukraine loses. Also, that there will be a lot of business opportunities and a lot of opportunities for new investments in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. I give you an example. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell down and when the communism fell apart, Austria or Vienna was basically a city in the east of the western part of Europe. It was, gray. It was on the periphery. With the fall of the wall, Vienna has become one of the best livable cities. They have become, rich, and they have become. They economically progressed unbelievably. Europe as well, United States. Many times, Central European countries tend to be more transatlantic than the Western European. The same would happen simply with Ukraine. You would see a lot of U.S. entities and a lot of U.S. businesses across the region and in Ukraine. And I think it's an opportunity for the U.S. as well.
In the minute we have left, you know the region well, you know Russia well. A year from now, it is December 2024. Where do you think we are in terms of the war, in terms of support? You see the trajectory around the world. What are you projecting?
This is a very difficult question of projecting, because also if you would ask me before the war in 2022, nobody was expected, not Russia, even not us, such a tremendous unity of the West. So there were a lot of surprises that we've been able to do. And I think that we've proven that West is not in decline, that if we stick together, there is a future for the West and for United States and Europe. So I can only say that I have a hope that Ukraine will be in position next year to say how they want to end the war, and that they will be able to push the occupying forces further away from the territory that they are today.
My guest today has been Robert Vass, founder and CEO of Globsec. Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us. And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.